everyone. Welcome to the Thrive Neurosport podcast series, hosted by myself, Katie Mitchell. I'm a PhD candidate, registered physiotherapist, and certified athletic therapist. And on this podcast series, we are discussing the latest research in concussion education, management, and rehabilitation to thrive on in sport and life. Today, for episode 4, I'm really excited to have Meaghan Shearer-Adams on the podcast. Meaghan's research examines the effects of concussion on how people integrate thinking, moving, and sensing the world around them. She specifically focuses on how complex integrative processes and the neural networks associated with these processes are affected. Combining neuroimaging, neurostimulation, biomechanical, virtual reality, and psychophysical techniques, she compares groups with no history of concussion to those who have fully recovered and those with persistent symptoms. This approach has the potential to identify the neurological changes responsible for persistent post-concussion symptoms. Her educational background is pretty extensive. Meaghan completed her undergraduate degree in life science and a master's in physical therapy from Queen's University, as well as her PhD in neuroscience at the University of Waterloo in 2018. She is currently a Vista postdoctoral fellow through York University and Toronto Rehabilitation Institute. Meaghan and I go way back. She's been kind of a mentor for me throughout my own PhD and has always been a kind of a sounding board for when I've got any kind of questions or things going on through my academic career and even my professional career. So I'm really excited. We've done a few podcasts in the past. So today we're really just going to dive into her story and her kind of career path, as well as her current research and certain opportunities that she's pursuing today. So welcome to the podcast, Meaghan.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome to catch up because we haven't really chatted much throughout COVID, but I'm sure lots has been going on and you're back in the lab, so things are kind of rolling again.
Yep. It's great to be back. We were shut down for a little while, and that was obviously necessary, but not really awesome. But it's we're back now, so it's good.
Yeah, that's great. You've got such a cool setup going at Toronto Rehab. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think a lot of people listening would be really interested in to hear kind of what your background has kind of led to where you are today and sort of how you started out from just kind of physiotherapy school to getting into academia again and kind of the pursuits that you went after from there.
For sure. So like you said, I did my undergrad and my physio degree at Queen's, and I finished physio school in 2008 and started working right away in both outpatient orthopedics and pediatrics. And I wasn't really sure where I wanted to end up, but at the time, it was easier to find 2 part-time jobs than 1 full-time. So I kind of did both. And eventually I sort of went the outpatient orthopedics route for no reason other than I had more opportunities available in places that I wanted to live. And I ended up with the opportunity to do the Fowler Kennedy Sport Physio Fellowship. And this was in, I started that in 2010, which was an amazing opportunity. I was the team physiotherapist for all of the sports at Fanshawe College, which sounds like a whole lot of work, except we only had 4 teams. So, but I did all of the coverage for all 4 varsity teams. And so it was really, really cool. I got to see a whole bunch of really cool things, and I worked with amazing mentors at Fowler Kennedy. And when I finished that, I wanted to do the Sport Physio Canada certificate exam, thinking that I would do more field work and stuff. So I was studying for the exam, and I had at this time left Fowler Kennedy, and a lot of the information or a lot of the prep for the exam required me to learn about concussion. And it was something that I hadn't learned about at all in physio school, or if they had covered it, it was not very extensively and it didn't stick with me. But for whatever reason, this time around, I found it fascinating. And I was working at a sports medicine clinic that had a physician who saw patients who'd had concussions. And he and I had a number of different conversations. And I finally convinced him that physios have a role to play in patients with brain injuries. And so he sent me he would refer a few patients. And very slowly, I started to build this practice of people who were having trouble getting better. And at the same time, I'm reading and I'm studying for the certificate exam. And I started to notice in this group of people that I was working with that a lot of them had trouble in busy environments. In the classic example is the grocery store, but each individuals would say different things. And I didn't have a good explanation because at the time, I understood that concussion symptoms would get worse if somebody was doing something that was really cognitively demanding, if they were, working on schoolwork or math problems or whatever. And we also knew that sports could be really demanding, and we had to kind of dose that carefully, or not sports, but exercise. So we were aware of not overloading people physically or cognitively, but we didn't have this sort of sensory picture. And from what people were telling me, I sort of started to think that maybe there was a sensory load component to this. Like if people were being bombarded by too much sensory information, the system was getting overloaded, just like if it was too cognitively demanding. So I decided, so I started, I'm going back through the research, right? Because I'm preparing for this exam at the same time. And I'm like taking courses and stuff. And like, what do we know? And people would say, yeah, it sounds like there's probably a sensory load and the system's being overloaded. And, there was this whole idea of focal versus spatial vision. And so it's probably something to do with that. But how, why, what's the story? Do we know? We didn't know. So I was like, well, here we go. I've got a question. Let's do some research. Let's figure it out. And I had a number of different conversations with people. And one of my old profs from Queens said to me, if you're going to do a study, you should go and do a PhD because you should get a credential from the research. And I was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go do a PhD. I just want to answer this question. It seemed really simple. What is the answer? Yes or no? This will inform us as we move forward. But in the end, I took her advice and went and did my PhD. And I did it at the University of Waterloo because I was living in Waterloo. And we were talking about this before we started, people always ask, how do you get involved in research? Well, for all of the good things that have happened in my life, I have just randomly cold emailed somebody, not in my whole life, but in my career. Most of the best things have started with just a cold email. And I randomly started emailing people. I would look on department websites and find scientists whose research programs sounded like my question would fit. And it was crickets. I heard nothing for a few months. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I need to go back to the drawing board. This is obviously not the plan for me. And then about 3 months later, I got an email from a prof at the University of Waterloo who had, I had emailed him this first round, and he replied and he said, listen, I'm really sorry I didn't get back to you. I've been hospitalized for the last 3 months because I've had a brain injury. And so your question, the project you're proposing is really relevant to me. Why don't you come in and we'll meet? One of the best decisions of my career. He was a fabulous mentor and a great person to work with. So I started my PhD at the University of Waterloo in 2012. And the project evolved to be we think it's a sensory overload situation. We think that when there's too much going on for somebody who has had a concussion or has had persistent symptoms, there's a problem with damping down information that's not relevant. So they go into a grocery store, which is the example people would tell me all the time. And, you walk down the aisle, and instead of just kind of being aware that there's stuff on both sides of you, maybe these people their brains, not the people consciously, but their brains are trying to take in too much detail, and they're trying to read the labels on the stuff on the shelves. So the project I set up was giving people two different stimuli at the same time. One of them was relevant and they had to use to do a motor task, and the other information was irrelevant. And we collected EEG, which is you put a cap and you're looking at electrical activity. It's brain waves, basically. And how do their brain waves differ when they have this irrelevant information versus when they have relevant information? And there were some pretty interesting differences. And in the people who'd had concussions versus the people who didn't have concussions. And all my people were healthy. They were all asymptomatic. They'd had their injuries in the past and they'd recovered. But the way that their brains responded to these stimuli, people who'd never had a concussion were the responses to irrelevant information were not very they were not as large. So the electrical activity was diminished based on whether something was relevant or irrelevant. The people who had concussions in their past, who had recovered, they didn't have this same modulation. So when something was relevant, their brain was just as excited by it as when it was irrelevant. And that's not the way that the controls were performing, because we want to know context matters, right? When something is relevant, we should pay more attention to it. But when it's this extraneous thing out in the periphery that we don't really care about, we don't really want to be devoting cortical resources to it. And then we did some work using CTBS, which is an electromagnetic tool to change the way that the brain responds. We did some work to show that possibly the prefrontal cortex is part of the network that is affected, where it's a part of your brain kind of right behind your forehead, above your eyes, and its job is to help you figure out higher order stuff. And we know it's involved in some of these decisions about relevant versus irrelevant. And when we modulated the activity of the prefrontal cortex, the way that people's brains responded looked a lot like the people with this history of concussion. So we kind of thought that, the prefrontal cortex might be not responsible, but involved in a larger network. So then that was my PhD, wrapped that up, and I now work as a postdoctoral fellow, which basically just means I'm a researcher. And I work, it's a partnership. My project is a partnership between a lab at York University and Toronto Rehab. And at Toronto Rehab, I get to use some really cool virtual reality equipment and balance testing. It's a really cool place to work. And some of the themes of the research are the same, like looking at cognitive motor integration and sensory integration and how these things are affected when people have had concussions from which they have recovered and are no longer symptomatic, and then as well people who are still symptomatic. So that was a lot of talking. I'll take a little, you can redirect me if I've gone off topic.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's awesome. You have such an extensive history and kind of what you've done too. And I think the common theme on this podcast has always been kind of personal questions that you've kind of developed through your own clinical experience, that you've kind of just been sitting there going, no one has an answer for me. And you wanted to try and figure it out. And I think that's one of the key things that I try to explain to people when they ask me, how did you how did you decide to pursue a PhD? Because much like yourself, my initial reaction was like, I don't want to do a PhD because it is long and it's really demanding. And I never saw myself doing a PhD in the kind of the beginning. And I started out very similar to you with a lot more field work and kind of being more in the trenches of it. But then when you're in those situations, you start to see these things where you're like, well, wait, like, why is that happening? And what do we do about it? And when people don't have answers, like you're kind of a doer. So you want to go figure it out. And I think it's awesome, the work that you did. I remember a talk that you did a couple years ago at one of the concussion events that we did at Laurier, and you talked about kind of that sensory gating as, if you had a highlighter and you wanted to highlight one specific thing in a room, for example, your brain just couldn't really function with that highlighter, that you couldn't kind of shut the door on other stimuli that you don't want to pay attention to. And I get a lot of patients that have that similar problem. So I think it's a really interesting thing that you're working on, because now you're kind of bridging that fundamental work that you did originally with much more clinically applicable work, directly with, like you said, a lot of different interventions. There's a long list there that I almost stumbled over in your bio. So with that, why don't you explain a little bit more of like kind of what exactly you're looking for and the different kind of lenses, I guess, that you're viewing it from, because a lot of the different like sort of testing that you're doing looks at it from different perspectives rather than just kind of using one analysis. So I think that's really, really cool.
Yes, it's a lot of moving pieces, but there's kind of a theme, at least in my head. So it comes, like you said, it all comes back to like the clinical part, right? And I saw a lot of patients whose post-concussion symptoms, whose persistent symptoms related to like dizziness and vertigo, and because I once I kind of had this concussion practice, I dove a little bit more deeply into vestibular physio. So I started working a lot with people who'd had post-concussion, like vestibulo-visual post-concussion disorders, if you're going to follow that sort of 3 disorder system. And all of the tools I had to assess people or track the progress, I felt that there were 2 big problems. And first is that we rely a lot on asking patients to report their own symptoms. And that's problematic for a number of reasons. But if you're having a good day, you're going to report your symptoms differently. Like if you're having a happy day, like if something good happened to you outside of your concussion, whatever, you got a promotion at work, you're going to report your symptoms differently than if it's raining and the bus drove by and splashed you. But like there's so many factors that impact a symptom self-report measure at the best of times. And at the worst of times, it's not just subconscious bias, but these kinds of tools are open to deception. So if we can come up with something that is more objective, we subvert those problems. And also there's this growing idea that symptoms get better before full neurological recovery has occurred. So even if we get better at reporting symptoms, that may not be the best tool to use anyways. The second problem, I think, is that a lot of the tools we use right now look at sensory systems separately without looking at how they interact, which is how we go through our daily lives. We integrate information from different senses. And I'm particularly interested in vision and vestibular sense in the work that I'm doing right now. And to function in a complex environment, we need to integrate information. And a lot of the things that people talk about after having concussion, having problems with, require visual and vestibular coordination. So that this comes back to the grocery store, and it's not just the idea of, there's too much to look at. Like I gave that example before, but that's a little bit overly simplistic. When you're going through a grocery store, there's a lot to see, but you have to navigate through that environment while you're looking at stuff. You have to think about what you need to buy and, what you have coming up in the week that you're buying for. And you have to plan and execute different movements, and you have to move around people. It's a lot more than just a visual situation. So we need tools that go beyond symptom measures, and we need tools that assess people in the way that they function in the world. So my goal is to start to develop a real world relevant way to assess how people with concussion cope with these multisensory challenges that they encounter during their ADLs, their activities of daily living. So like I said, I do research in a virtual reality environment, which is known as Street Lab, and it's fantastic because it's I think it's a 240-degree screen. It's like 3/4 of a surround screen, and we have an amazing computer or video game designer, and he's designed this grocery store simulation. And I stand people at the start of an aisle, and the visual scene moves to simulate moving down a grocery store aisle. But because they're not actually moving, there's a mismatch in what their vestibular system is telling them. And we have them on a force platform. And we look at the force platform allows us to look at balance responses or postural sway, because that's something that has the potential to be objective. We have measurements that we can quantify stability. So we can look at how balance changes when these indicators of visual motion conflict with the other signals, because we know that to maintain balance, we use vision, we use vestibular sense, and we use somatosensation or proprioception. But when one of those conflicts with the others, how does the brain manage that conflict, and how does that affect balance? And then how is that different in somebody whose brain is functioning differently? So it's unique because we have this, it's a lab, right? We have all of the safety measures that come with being in a lab. We have these laboratory-based methods, but we're able to link that to everyday functional activities. And then that has real implications for how we clinically manage these patients. And I am most interested in people in middle adulthood. I don't know what the right term is. I've used working adults a few times, but some people don't like that because not everybody, I would argue that everybody does work, but some people interpret that as just working outside the home. But anyways, I think concussion research has focused a lot on kids and athletes. And I think there's this group in the middle that struggles with persistent symptoms, and but they're huge contributors to the economy. Like if people can't get back to work after concussion, like that has big implications for families and lives and stuff. So that's kind of the population I tend to focus on, and I'm interested in how we can inform these return to work decisions with good evidence.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I actually commonly see, and you nail it on the head when you said a lot of the research does focus on specific groups, because I think it's more like just based on the sporting population, and we see sport-related concussion, and typically like your kind of middle-aged adult, kind of I'm thinking more of the 30-plus crowd. They're more along the lines of the retired athlete, if not like more recreational to, they didn't sustain their concussion via sport. So actually, I see more of those people probably in my clinical practice now than I do, and mainly because sports aren't probably like they're not on right now because of COVID, but I'm getting more of the persistent cases from those kind of middle-aged adults. And I do think it is incredibly relevant because those people are trying to, return just like their livelihood of their occupation or, taking care of their family properly. Like those things are really important. And it's, and I think we've taken notice of that more because of COVID, because of the changes in lifestyles and, importance of being able to work and be able to do your job and also manage maybe homeschooling and do all these other things. So it's been a whole like kind of, spin on things this year. But I think it's really, really interesting. It sort of reminds me of you probably read this paper, the National paper with the moving room paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, the Toronto Rehab folks probably have looked into that one, but when they looked at the manipulation of the visual scene, and then they were actually just standing still, and people kind of responded like the floor was moving, but yet only the walls were kind of inducing some visual motion. And so I commonly hear this reported by patients that, and they always say, oh, it's always when I'm moving or something. It's not really like specific to one movement. It's like if I bend over and come back up, or if I'm driving and then kind of like looking around. And it's this idea of like this kind of like visual dominance, I sort of call it, in reference to maybe like the vestibular information maybe isn't as reliable. So we're relying so much on vision that when visual motion is incurred, that actually throws people more off balance. Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, we
somewhat.
we are very visually dominant, like as people, right? And you like think about, I think an example that everybody can relate to is the moving train. So you're on a train or whatever. I don't live in Toronto, so I take the train a lot. So we're on a train, and there's a train beside you, and the train beside you starts to move, and you have this full visual field, like visual motion stimulus. That's your whole visual field looking out the window. And you get the feeling that you are the one moving, even though you have no other cues to indicate movement. You have that like perception. You buy into the illusion because there's all this visual motion around you. So yeah, vision is really important to how we perceive our movements through the world.
Yeah, definitely. I think like I've heard the report of, sitting in a parked car and even the car beside them moves.
And then you slam on the brakes.
Yeah. And a person's just like, oh, I felt like I was moving. And I think that it's the vestibular system is kind of like you said, it's not our dominant system. We don't really we're not aware of it, I think, as much as we are with vision, obviously, because it's something we directly just perceive. But I think that people don't realize they have a dysfunctional vestibular system because of necessarily like they don't really, I guess they don't always get dizziness with it, or it's just more of some people get more cognitive fatigue from that dysfunction rather than like just purely a dizziness. And they're saying, oh, well, I'm not dizzy. I just get really, really tired, and different other symptoms like that. So I find that kind of just in recent years, I've been looking more into the link between the two. And, you mentioned even just navigating a store, for example, and being able to kind of like decide what you need or find it, and just like kind of navigate through people moving around you and, not bumping into things. So there is a big kind of like that perception to action piece, which I always kind of refer back to, but it seems very similar to that. And so I guess what you're really trying to do is like kind of bring all those things together. And I don't know if you're including like other measures to determine if there is more purely like a cognitive versus vestibular. Like, are you screening these people with certain things as well?
Yeah. There's a whole screen that goes in. So we'll do like a dynamic visual acuity to see what the vestibular system is, how the vestibular system is functioning. And then there's, a vision screen and a cognitive screen, and some other vision, like visual perceptual tasks to kind of get a picture. And then we're looking at also the idea of how susceptible people are to that. So that train illusion, or the car and the car beside you starts to move, that feeling where that illusory self motion, like you get the illusion that you are moving, that's known as vection. So we're looking at that as well to see if that relates. Like if, you get these postural changes, if there's some relationship between your postural stability and your ability to induce this vection feeling. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes along with it. Yeah.
Yeah, because the more I get into research, I realize like how hard it is to actually look at this population, because we're looking for, at the beginning you said you want to figure out yes or no, is this happening? Yeah. But you're never going to find a yes or no. It's usually what you're looking at across the board of variability.
That was a very naive view. Yeah.
Yeah, I had the same idea though. Oh, they're just going to be like it is or it isn't. That's going to be black or white. But of course, it's very gray. So I wonder, because I've been reading a lot more about kind of like clustering people in certain ways, or kind of like identifying more of the heterogeneous presentation based on like whether these people may have a cognitive, like maybe they in their screen they had, they're more susceptible to that vection you spoke of, or perhaps maybe they have more of a cognitive component. Are you going to try and kind of pool people based on that, like based on what you find? I guess that's going to
Yeah.
be kind of how it plays out, but I guess more so like instead of looking at kind of like a straight answer, are you looking kind of across the board with different measures?
Ideally, it all depends on numbers, right? Like, and COVID isn't making recruitment any easier,
No, it's
but
not.
it would be great if I could have enough, like a large enough sample size that I could look at people who showed more, susceptibility to vection, or more visual dominance, or if I could kind of pull those people out and look at them differently. It remains to be seen whether that will happen. But I think, like, brain injuries are tricky to study at the best of times because they're so different. Like, every brain injury is an individual presentation, and with some types of brain injuries, we can group them a little bit better because we know, there's some imaging and it's a specific area that's affected or whatever. We don't have that with concussion. We have these symptom clusters where some people have symptoms that are more exacerbated by exercise, and some people have symptoms that are more related to probably a whiplash type injury. But we're still, like, it's all still coming back to the symptoms that people are telling us. We don't understand enough about the neurophysiology of this injury to be able to say, this is a different type of concussion than this. I'm talking with my hands, but group A has a different type of concussion than group B. We just don't know. And it may in the future come out that, concussion is not just one homogeneous injury or one population, but we're not at that point yet. So it hopefully we will be able to. It comes down to, did you look at the right thing to be able to tell if these people are different? And hopefully by doing a whole bunch of baseline measures, we can understand individual differences a little bit better, and then have the numbers in the study, have a large enough study population to be able to see some group differences. But I think a lot of the really important thing when looking at a group like this, or a condition like this, is looking at variability between people, and variability in responses. And what we saw in my PhD work was that the control, the healthy population, people were a lot more similar to each other. And then in the group who had a history of concussion, people's responses were, like, the range of responses was much wider. So that may be where we're at right now. Like, we're not able to break the concussion group up small enough. So we just have this really wide variability in the group.
Yeah, I've definitely kind of run into that myself with, trying to group people based on like, are they different? But then yet the difference is actually more across, like, within that group themselves, rather than being like the specific, average of just the concussion group being different from the control group. It's never come down to that in really anything that I've done in my own work. But usually it's this, all of a sudden we're like, well, why is this, like, why are these people all so different? But it comes down to, of that kind of up to 30%, I think, is probably more accurate. But of people who have those more prolonged symptoms versus people who recover kind of faster without those kind of prolonged difficulties with symptoms. So I think that when you kind of cluster, especially like when you just take people acutely kind of on intake, you're never going to be able to capture it. But especially looking at more prolonged cases, you might find that there are some more similarities based on kind of the pool that you get, and perhaps just like the way that they kind of come into your lab, being kind of through whatever sort of, rehab they've maybe pursued is maybe how they're coming in, right? Through your recruitment processes, which is great. But then it also creates kind of like a sample based on, if it's coming in through a certain clinic or something that also kind of affects it too. So it comes down to this huge conundrum of like, what's the best way to run a study? And it does make it really difficult. So like you're taking on a huge undertaking with all this. But I wanted to touch on something you referred to, just looking at like mood. And I know you're a big advocate for kind of the biopsychosocial approach being applied to concussion as well as just like pain science. And you talked about whether someone's having like kind of a happier mood day or whether they're kind of more down in the dumps kind of day. And are you doing any sort of measures for like more emotional or like psychological kind of baseline?
Yeah. I spoke to the people at the Hull Ellis Clinic at Toronto Rehab, which is a concussion clinic there, and they directed me toward a personality inventory, which I can't remember the name at the moment, but the idea is like you look at personality factors and resilience and things that will affect your response to injury, just like in your own personal makeup. And in the end, is that related? Is that a variable that we can trace back to anything? I don't know, but I think it's an important thing. I'm a big fan of the biopsychosocial model, and I've been doing a lot of reading about that lately because I think we can and probably should apply it systematically in conditions beyond pain, but actually doing that in a clinically relevant and useful way. I don't think we've kind of laid out how to do that yet. So I've been reading a lot about that, and I think there's a lot of like inherent factors that we need to capture as well. So the name of the personality inventory escapes me, but that's kind of my attempt to do that.
We can include it in the show notes.
Yeah, people are really interested. They can send me if they're really interested. There's probably like 2 people that want to know, but
yeah. Well, it's interesting though, because the group that you're focusing in on are probably more likely to have a lot more life stressors and, different variables rather than like kind of adolescents and younger adults have less responsibilities in general. So, whether they have families to look after or like other dependents, like the kind of job that they have, all those different things that perhaps the injury may be kind of removing them from, that would be causing a lot more like financial stress, and just adding a lot more other variables there that make that a much more complicated group to study too, which I think it's really important to identify some of those other things. Especially when people are looking to return to work and, there's stress around that, or, like whether someone's like a teacher, for example, and it's very seasonal of kind of like coming back to school year in September is very different. Like when they've got summer to kind of, take the time if they need to, or whatever they're returning to work, there's just a lot more demand there. And so I find that I'm definitely trying to incorporate that more with the patients that I am consulting and treating. And I think it is something that is underutilized across the board. And it's not taught well in general, I don't think, in programs right now. Again, I can't speak to currently, but you probably have a better idea based on your involvement with that. So in the, like, I guess with your end goal in this, would it be that you want to incorporate, like be able to, I guess, indicate whether like something like VR could be applicable to clinical use more so? And I'm assuming not more in like the cave environment like you have at the street lab, but even in like an Oculus type of VR, is that something you want it to eventually translate into clinic, that actually clinicians could be using something like you've created and translating that into actual application?
Yeah, I think I don't know so much about the tool. Like a big VR cave is not practical for most places. But I think if, VR may just be a research tool to understand the relationship between these factors, the vision and the other senses and how they impact balance. It may end up being part of an assessment tool down the line, or we may be able to turn to something else. Looking at balance more specifically, if we can recreate the sensory conditions outside of VR, which is probably not as likely, but who really knows? I look at what I'm doing right now as trying to, it's probably foundational or fundamental work that's going to, I hope, down the line lead to changes in how we do our assessments, whether that means we use VR for assessment or we have new assessment tools that we can draw on. I'm not sure yet how it will look. My work with the fact that I have a partnership with York, I work with a professor who's developed a tablet-based reaching and pointing tool, and Joe Hurtubise, who you interviewed, has done a lot more work with this than I have. But we're also using that because some of the work that Joe did showed that this tool is sensitive to changes in brain areas that also relate back to vestibular and visual processing and integration. And, maybe there's a relationship between some of the things that I'm measuring on these lab-based tools. Maybe there are certain things that we can pick up on these more clinically deployable tablet-based tools. And if we can understand the relationship, then we can interpret the results from these tablet-based things in a different way or in a different population or something. So Joe's Birdie, it's
Birdie, yeah.
Birdie, yeah. It stands for Brain Dysfunction Indicator, this tablet-based software that Dr. Lauren Sergio has developed. We use that as well as one of those other measures that helps us get a fuller picture of what's going on with these people. And I think something like that is probably where that's probably what's going to end up being more useful clinically. I'm just, hopefully what I'm doing will help us interpret that data or use it more sensitively.
Yeah, to determine kind of how those real world experiences translate into the clinical findings. And I think overall you want to create more objectivity. And I think that's a goal for a lot of us, is trying to figure out ways that, you can quantify something or show people to be able to track it rather than being a subjective report or a subjective observation. Like balance in particular is something that is objectively observed and we don't really quantify it, but yet we tell people it's either worse, better, unchanged, whatever.
Yep.
But how do we actually know? And that's one of the things that really resonates with me a lot more. And I'd love to be able to have a force plate in practice. Like I work on that, but it's not accessible for everybody.
No.
And so certain tech is, and it's the amount of tech that you can acquire is, again, it's an accessibility financially, whether it's practical for clinics to use. And I think VR is definitely something that could be practically used. I just don't know, like we haven't created like a robust enough assessment measure rather than like interventions, because there's software out there you can buy that is used as an intervention, but we don't really have VR assessments. So like it is something that you could assess with other tools and then maybe use VR as an intervention measure, like whether you create a world where they're having to navigate a grocery store, a mall, or something that's like similar to that, where there's a crowded area with lots of stimuli. I think those are feasible, but like it's just so much work has to be done to actually get there. Like any assessment tool goes through a lot of rigorous testing. So, there's a lot of private companies out there that come out with things, but again, they have to be validated and determined to be reliable for their testing. So I think what you're doing is like a huge step in understanding what a lot of these other measures are figuring out, like whether they correlate to each other to be able to say whether, you can use that birdie to identify people who have trouble with this potentially, or maybe there's a correlation between those findings, and even some other things. So, it does inform a lot of people about how those things are actually, how we can interpret some of those findings better.
Yeah.
And so for you, I guess, like moving forward, and kind of, I guess, in your goals for what you're going to do, kind of taking these projects forward. Obviously, finishing them is goal number one. I'm with you on that because of COVID delaying everything for so many months. But I guess you're kind of getting into some teaching and other pieces. So why don't you speak a little bit to that and how you're kind of, I guess, taking some of the work that you've done and maybe translating in those ways as well.
Yeah, yes, it would be great to get these studies wrapped up and out there, and but I think we're all in the same boat, so that's at least comforting. I don't know what the long-term plan is. There hasn't really been, and this is very hard for me because I am a planner. Like that's what I do. But from the beginning, sending a cold email to somebody and having it work out really well, I haven't had I haven't followed a really strict plan through this part of my career. I really like teaching, and I've done it for a long time. I put myself through university teaching swimming lessons, and kind of haven't stopped since then. But so now I've been teaching online post-professional courses for a while. I've started this year, this month actually, beginning of August, I started teaching with McMaster in their physio school, which I really, really enjoy. And so I'm trying to develop those skills. It's been really, really interesting because I have been teaching online to practicing clinicians for probably 3 or 4 years now, but COVID has changed a lot of the way that we teach at the university level, and particularly teaching physio students who need to develop hands-on skills. So it's been a crash course in teaching like pedagogy and learning how to teach and learning how people learn, which I've found really, really interesting. And there is so much more available now in the last kind of 6 months about how to develop good courses and how to, the experience of being a teacher. So I'm really enjoying learning more about that. I don't know where that's going to lead. I don't know if that's going to end up being a full-time thing, or I don't know. My ultimate goal would be to continue doing this research. I love what I do. I always say I have the best job in the world. And I love doing research and getting paid to ask questions. So that would be my ultimate goal. But I'm learning that I really like this type of teaching and working with physio students and healthcare students, and so that may be part of the future as well. It remains to be seen. I probably have another year left of my postdoc, and I'm going to try to explore what other opportunities I can and see where I go.
It's like, I feel like all of 2020 is like a crash course in learning how to do everything differently. So
Yeah.
it's pretty much just like everything is kind of unforeseen of what the next year or two will even bring for most people. So, you said it's a lot more comforting when everybody else is kind of in this same uncertainty boat. So, I think it's a lot easier to navigate.
And I always say, I worked clinically, and I worked clinically all through my PhD, and I really enjoy it, and I love working with the patients. And so I could always go back to that. But what I'm realizing is what I would be going back to is very different from what I left. Healthcare has changed a lot. So it's kind of everywhere you turn. Like teaching looks different than it ever did before. Learning for our students, like our physio students coming out now, are going to have skills that we certainly didn't have. Like they're going to learn how to do an online, assessment and treatment, whereas we were all kind of just muddling through for the last 6 months. And research is changing too. So it's interesting it's really cool to watch, but it's doesn't help with making plans and knowing where I'm going to be.
I feel you on that. I feel the same way where I'm much more a planner for longer term, but like I feel like I'm moving week to week right now, and it's very I guess frustrating, but I think you said it best for like any kind of students or clinicians who are interested in kind of thinking that, because I think from their lens, it looks like, someone like yourself had this all kind of planned out, and that it was like, from the get-go, you knew you were going to go into this and this, but a common theme across all of these things, and even like Jo herself said this, is like, never saw herself doing a PhD, didn't really know what that research was going to look like until really and it probably evolved even as you were in it. Like I know for myself, my research has changed completely from when I started. And then where you are in your postdoc is completely something that's kind of just come up, and you kind of work by the year. It's not like that far in advance that you plan for. So being flexible in that process is hugely important. I think a lot of especially like physio and healthcare students, they are planners. Like everybody kind of has that same personality trait of being that type A planner that like wants to have their future planned now. They want their next 5 years planned. And I think one of the biggest lessons you learn throughout academia and even in something like a clinical career is that, it is unpredictable, and you're probably going to make changes and kind of pivot or whatever you're going to do, whatever it's this whole society doing it together or whether it's just yourself and what your interests are. So,
and I mean, I had 2 kids too, right? Like I had I had my first child during my PhD, which is, I mean, it was great. It worked out well for me. No, it's not uncommon, but there's a lot of people that tell you that's a terrible idea. And then I had my second son like 3 months into my postdoc. That was not awesome. That was not good timing. But like I had applied for the postdoc grant and gotten turned down and found out I was pregnant, and then got it a few months later. So it was all like, it's all beyond your control.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where like you can't just panic every time something doesn't go exactly your way, because likely something is going to work out in the long run. So yeah, I think honestly, like the students now are just going to learn how to adapt and, be able to work with this kind of more hybrid model of telehealth and in clinic. And it's going to be really interesting to see how some of the measures that we use for concussion care, vestibular care, and balance assessment, like, I've been kind of winging those things through telehealth, but, there hasn't been any research to really say how we can do these things and how valid they are. And really it's like, well, is it better just to kind of do something and, intervene and start somewhere, or to be perfectly valid and objective about it, via telehealth when we just are learning how to use it, and for most people. So that's going to be really interesting to see how the next couple of years rolls out and how we evolve that way. Because I think it'd be really neat to have some ways to remotely test and evaluate people, to create accessibility to different practitioners, and also just be able to reach a kind of broader geographical area even.
And I think, looking at these tablet-based measures that both Jo and I have used, I think that's part of why I don't tie myself to like VR is the future, because I don't know, like if telehealth is here to stay, which I firmly believe that it is, we need things that don't tie us to a physical location. And, having a tablet-based measure, having a web-based measure that, you can download an app and have your results sent to your physio, but then your physio can interpret your results and know a little bit more about what's happening kind of below the surface. I think that's probably our future.
Yeah, for sure. They're starting to see certain companies move that way, with different apps and different things that you can use. And I'm definitely trying to figure out some of those things myself still, of like how I can utilize that with some of the telehealth patients I see. So yeah, it's super interesting. Like I said, you feel like it's like even a project like yourself is a huge project, But even in the grand scheme of like how it's going to contribute is like typically a smaller dent in things, but it's still a stepping stone for a lot of these other pieces to be pulled together and build the future of what healthcare is going to look like, which is super, very, very cool.
Yeah, it is.
So why don't we're getting around to the hour here? So why don't you share? I know you did have your kind of clinical education courses on Embodia. If there's
Yeah.
anything you want to share, or your Instagram or website, anything like that, you can share for everyone.
I do have a website. It is www.meaghanadams.com. I have stopped doing Instagram because I was doing such a bad job at it. And it just became another one of those things that I was like, I really should post something. I really should get on that. And I got tired of saying should to myself. So I just shut the whole thing down. I'm on Twitter at Meaghan Adams PT. And yes, I have courses on Embodia. I am, Meaghan, sorry. Yes. Meaghan.
We'll put it in the show notes too.
Yeah. Yes. Isn't that the only way to spell it? Come on. Yeah. So meaghanadams.com, Meaghan Adams PT on Twitter. And I have courses on Embodia. I'm in the process of doing some updates on those, which I have been in the process of doing for a long time now. COVID did not speed that up, but one day.
It's like everything.
Yeah. And, I just keep saying anybody who starts taking the courses now, they will get the updates for free when they are ever published. So
perfect.
That's all good. Yeah, I think that's where you find me. And there's a link to email through the website. So if you really have questions that I didn't answer.
Yeah, we'll post that there in the show notes for anyone who wants to reach out. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me. You have such a wealth of knowledge. I feel like we could talk for a long time about different things. But yeah, it's been excellent, like taking some time out of your busy schedule. I know you're getting kind of ready to start teaching, or if you're already teaching, and you are managing 2 children at home and everything too. So a lot of things going on, a lot of balls in the air. So I really appreciate your time to join me here.
No, anytime. It's always fun to chat with you guys. Yeah, my son, my 6-year-old has just recently gotten into podcasts himself. So I was telling him that I was going to be talking on a podcast. He thought that was pretty cool. So,
you're the cool mom. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying.
That's amazing. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening to the Thrive Neurosport series. You can find me. I do have Instagram. I'm at Thrive Neurosport. And you can learn more about clinical neurosport education on my website, thriveneurosport.ca. But until next time, keep thriving on, friends.
Concussion Talk podcast is presented by HeadCheck Health. HeadCheck Health bridges the gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Track Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada, who rely on HeadCheck Health to improve communication and optimize care. Visit headcheckhealth.com for more. Music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound. www.bensound.com.